A lot of people in today's world, and even Christians, like to use the word passion or passionate in a positive connotation. Well, if you actually look at the scriptural meaning behind it, it's not positive at all. We can see in Galatians 5:24, it says, "Those who are Christ have crucified the flesh along with its passions and desires." The Amplified says, "Crucify the flesh along with its passions, appetites, and desires." So I like to call these your PADs, your passions, appetites, desires, or passions and desires, whichever one you want to say. But either way, we need to crucify these things. We need to crucify our passions, appetites, and desires. They're not good things, they're actually bad things. So to dissect this, let's look at the meaning of the word passion. Passion has multiple meanings. The first meaning actually is a suffering. And we can see this in Acts chapter 1 verse 3, where it's talking about the suffering that Christ endured for us. So that's not what we're talking about when we say we have a passion for something or we're passionate. We're not talking about the suffering. The definition that we're talking about with passion actually is to be acted upon. We're not in control. Our mind is being controlled by an outside agent. We are not in control. We're being acted upon. We're being acted upon by our passions, our appetites, our desires. That passion is being acted upon. You are not in control. Another definition is actually a disorder of the mind. So passion is not good. And we can look at this, again, a lack of self-control. 1 Corinthians 7:9, it says, Paul is talking about those who are as a couple. It says, if those people cannot exercise self-control, it is better for them to marry. For it is better for them to marry than to burn with passion. Again, it's a lack of self-control. If you're passionate about something, you're not in control. And even further than that, Proverbs 14:30 in the Amplified says that passion and envy are rottenness to the bones. It rots our bones. So don't cherish passion. Don't justify your passion and say that it's good. It's actually bad. Crucify those things. Crucify them. Now, to give you an example, say you're a Chicago Cubs fan. You're a passionate Chicago Cubs fan. If they're playing in the World Series, are you going to go out with your friends, go out with your family? Are you going to go to church? Or are you going to miss church to stay at home and watch the Cubs game? You know, if they play on a Wednesday night, are you going to skip church service and watch the Cubs? That's what we're talking about with passion. You're not in control. Okay, now this may be an extreme example. I know you might be thinking, well, what about passion for God? I'm passionate for God. There's nothing wrong with that. That's actually good. Well, that's what the enemy wants you to think. I'm passionate for God, so this is a good thing. Well, again, your passion causes you not to be in control, and you're going to be led according to your passion and not according to the Spirit of God. You're going to be going off doing things that you think are God or that you think are good, and instead of actually seeking it from the truth, through the Word, from the Holy Spirit, from God Himself, by getting on your knees and saying, Lord, what do you want me to do here? And we see that with a lot of missionaries today. And nothing against missionaries. There are a lot of God-called missionaries. But if God has not called you to be a missionary, then don't do it just because you think it's good. You're moving according to a passion and not according to the leading of the Holy Spirit. We need to be led of God, not led of our passions. That's the danger. So even a passion for God is not good. You just need to be led of His Spirit. Get in the Word and read the Word and be led according to what the Word tells you to do. Be obedient to the Word, not according to passions, appetites, and desires. We need to crucify these things. And if we don't crucify them, we fall into the PAD progression. And we'll look at this. The PAD progression, it's a cycle. And it goes on and just keeps going until we crucify our passions, appetites, and desires. So let's look at this PAD progression. So as we look at this PAD progression, you see at the top is our PADs, our passions, our appetites, and our desires. So to really fill all this in, we need to read James chapter 1, really verses 14 and 15, but we'll start at 13. And it says, "Let no one say when he is tempted, I am tempted by God. For God cannot be tempted by evil, nor does He Himself tempt anyone. But each one is tempted when he is drawn away by his own desires and enticed. Then when desire has conceived, it gives birth to sin, and sin, when it is full grown, brings forth death. So we can see here in verses 14 and 15 that there is a progression. There's a cycle here. So it starts out with our pads, and as we have pads, then a temptation comes. That temptation is there because we have that passion, appetite, or desire. We wouldn't be tempted if we didn't have those passions, appetites, and desires. Okay, so now that the temptation is there, if we yield to that temptation, if we yield to it, it'll bring forth sin. So, and again, this is pulling you out of the plan of God. So, and you can see this, we're tempted when he is drawn away by his own desires. What you're being drawn away from is the plan of God. These desires, they're not bringing you closer to God. They're pulling you away from God. They're pulling you out of the plan that he has for your life. So, and as we yield to that temptation, it brings forth sin. Sin. Okay, and then as that sin comes, when it's full grown, it brings forth death. Now, this may be a passion just in one little area of your life. So this may not be referring to death of the full physical body. It may be just a part of your spiritual life. It could be your whole physical body. We don't know that, but that's why we just have to be on guard, be vigilant, be sober. The adversary of the devil, he is walking about like a roaring lion, seeking whom he may devour. We have to be on guard, and we be on guard by crucifying these passions, appetites, and desires. And if we don't, we fall into this progression. We have the pads, leads to temptation, goes to sin, and then leads to death. And you may think, well, is that the end? Well, no, it's actually not the end. Because you can read in Romans chapter 7, especially in verses 5 and in verses 8, and it's talking about that those pads, the sin arouses even more evil temptation, even more evil passions and desires. So let's read Romans chapter 7, verse 5. When we were living in the flesh, the sinful passions that were awakened and aroused up by what the law makes sin were constantly operating in our natural powers, so that we bore fruit to death. Okay, so these passions were awakened and aroused by what the law makes sin. So sin is arousing these sinful passions, these desires within us. So if we have a passion, appetite, or desire in one area of our life, we fall into sin in that area. That sin is going to go on to create even more evil passions and desires that is just going to continue this cycle. We can see that again in Romans 7:8. But sin, finding opportunity in the commandment, got a hold of me and aroused and stimulated all kinds of forbidden desires. It aroused all kinds of forbidden desires through that sin. So if we fall into sin, it's going to create these more passions and desires. And this cycle is just going to keep going until you crucify these passions, appetites, and desires, or until it does lead to complete total death. That's what's going to happen. So we have to be sure that we're crucifying these passions, these appetites, and these desires. So the pad progression, we have to cut it off. We have to crucify these passions, these appetites, and desires. And we've talked a lot about passions. We haven't talked that much about desires. You may think, well, desires are a good thing. You can read Psalm 37:4, and it says, delight yourself in the Lord, and he will give you the desires of your heart. Well, what he's really talking about there is delighting yourself in the Lord is doing his word, being obedient to his word. And his word says that those who are Christ have crucified the flesh along with its passions, its appetites, and its desires. So delighting yourself in the Lord is crucifying those desires, those passions. And as we do that, then the Lord gives us the desires that he would want us to have, to be obedient to his word, to glorify him, to magnify him here on this earth, to be salt and light to this world. Those are his desires, and that's what he gives us as we crucify our passions, our appetites, our desires. You can look at what Jesus said. You know, if anyone desires to come after me, let him deny himself and pick up his cross and follow after me. There's a desire there. What do you do with it? Well, Jesus says you must deny yourself. Again, that's crucifying the passions, the appetites, and the desires. We've got to get rid of them. Get rid of them. You can look at Mark chapter 4, verses 18 and 19, talking about the Word. And as the Word is sown among thorns, what those desires do, those desires, they come in and they choke out the Word. They choke out the Word. So if we choose to hold on to these passions, these appetites, and desires, they're going to choke out the Word. We're going to forsake God's plan for our life, and it is going to ultimately lead to death. You can read in Jonah 1:8, and it says, those who regard worthless idols, they forsake their own mercy, their own God. If we're regarding our passions, our appetites, and our desires, we're forsaking the plan that God has for our life, and it is going to lead to death. Crucify your passions, your appetites, your desires, your pads. Get rid of them. Do not fall into the pad progression, the cycle that is never ending. Crucify these things. Crucify them. Walk with God. Get in His Word. Seek His plan for your life. Do not be led by passion, because remember, passion is something that's acting upon you. You're not in control. You've lost control if you're moving in passion. Be in control. Seek the Lord and what He would want to do in your life. Be led of Him by His Spirit. Get in His Word. Seek Him daily. Deny yourself daily. If you find yourself with these passions, these appetites, and these desires, look at 1 Corinthians 9:27. We're to discipline our body. We're to bring it into subjection. We are to crucify these things. Discipline yourself. Crucify your passions, your appetites, and your desires.